Hello and welcome to another episode of creating an underwater survival game like Subnautica. In this episode, we'll be creating a storage system for the game. So to start off the episode, I'm going to import some assets and icons that we're going to need today. I'm going to be importing a table to do crafting on, as well as some sprites for our game objects. We're going to be importing some models also so that we can add more items to the game. So most of these are assets I found free on the asset store. So I'm going to install them into the project. There's also a free asset on the asset store, which actually makes it very easy to outline three-dimensional objects. So I've used this in a lot of projects. It's very easy to use. So I recommend it to everybody. So yeah, we've imported a lot of assets. I'm going to move all of them into our external assets folder. So now I'm just going to set up all of these new objects as inventory objects now. Create the interactable, descriptable objects for them as well as the world prefabs. Right, before we get into creating the item scriptable objects for each of these items, um, there was actually an update I wanted to do to the item scriptable object script. So if I go to scripts and then I go to inventory, the item scriptable object script is here. After a lot of thought, I decided that it would be better to derive the name of the item from the actual name of the item scriptable object rather than having a string dedicated to the item name. So I'm just going to delete that and then save. Since in the code so far we haven't actually used it for anything, we don't need to change it, but later on I'll show you, instead of taking from item name, we would do from just straight up name. So here the name of the item is large fish. So there's no point repeating it twice. Oh, actually one more thing I'm going to do in this item scriptable object. I'm just going to set the default size to 1 by 1. So with that, every time we create a scriptable object, the default size is 1 by 1 instead of 0 by 0. Before we make all the scriptable objects, actually I created a sprite sheet for all of the objects, so I'm going to upload it here. So I'm going to set it to sprite 2D and UI and set the sprite mode as multiple. Then I can go to the sprite editor. Now for most 3D Unity projects, the sprite editor is usually not been installed. So if you want to install it, you'll need to go to the package manager. And if you go to Unity registry, you can search for sprite. And here you have 2D sprite, so you just need to install it. So once it's installed, you should be able to go to the sprite editor. Here I'm just going to set the sprite slicing to automatic. But I'm going to have the sprite logo at the top left. No, actually I'm going to have it at the center, that's right. So I'm just going to click slice. Sometimes Unity has some problems with slicing, so you just have to go in and readjust it yourself. So I'm just going to click rip apply, and now we should have all of the sprites we need. So now we go back to scriptable objects. I'm going to leave the fish sprites as they are. So now I'm going to apply the sprites for all of them. Do note that the table game object, you're not going to be able to pick it up and put it in the inventory. Instead, you'll interact with it to open the crafting menu. So it doesn't actually need a sprite. Now I will skip to after we finish creating the scriptable objects. Okay, with that, the scriptable objects are done. Now I wanted to take a look at the inventory item prefab. Actually, because it uses interactable, it doesn't actually need to use interactable object. Okay, so for the inventory item prefab, this is going to be an item displayed in the inventory. However, when adding the storage system, we're going to need a way to differentiate between which items are in the storage area and which items are in the inventory. So I'm going to actually create a new interactable object script. So actually in scripts in UI, I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to call it Interactable UI Object. Okay, now if I open up this script, it's quite similar to Interactable UI Object, but since I'm going to be adding some functionality to Interactable UI Object later, I'm just going to make it a completely separate script. So I'm going to delete, start, and update. I'm just going to write a note here. So I'm going to create a public item scriptable object to keep track of what item it is, as well as an interactable bool to check whether an item is interactable or not. And then I'm going to do a inventory system variable so that it can keep track of which storage it's in. This is because later on we're going to create the storage manager by inheriting from the inventory system script. And thus we would use inventory system to keep track of whether it's the storage manager script or the inventory system script. I'm also going to add two functions to this. One of them that makes the item non-interactable or interactable, and then the second one which sets the storage box of this item. So now I can apply this script to the inventory item prefab. Then I can remove the interactable object script. Later on, I'm going to edit the inventory system script so that it will take in an interactable UI object instead of an interactable object. Now for the next part, we're actually going to add the ability to highlight items when the player is hovering over them. So in order to do this, we're going to need to do a few things. First, in the interactable object class, we need to add a outline component that we imported earlier in order to turn on and off the outline of the object. And then afterwards, we're actually going to be moving all object interaction to the player controller script instead of doing it individually on each of the manager scripts. And since we are doing player interaction from the player controller, we're actually also going to be creating a base class for the UI so that we can make sure that only one menu is open at a time. And since player controller is controlling it, we can do that easily. So I'm going to start with the interactable object script. So if I open up interactable object, I'm going to be adding quite a few things. First of all, I'm going to require a component called outline. So outline is the name of the script that allows the object to be highlighted. The easiest way to use it is to just enable and disable it to turn on and off the highlight. So when I do require a component, if the object does not have an outline component, it will actually spawn in one. For interactable object, I'm also going to add a bool interactable so that we can disable objects at certain times. So that when we make the crafting table, while it's crafting something, you can't access the menu. Of course, we set interactable to true by default. Now I'm going to add the code that will allow the item to be highlighted. So how this works is basically we keep the outline as a variable on the interactable object as well as the player controller. And then in update, we check if the player controller is hovering over any of the items. If it's not hovering over anything, then outline has to be set to false. And then we will have a function that will turn on the outline. Okay, so in update, we'll have to do it later because right now we haven't moved the interaction with objects to the player controller yet. So I will return to this later. Okay, now I'm going to create the UI base class. So if I go to UI and I create a new script, I'm going to call it UI base class. So the inventory system, the crafting manager, the crafting manager, the storage manager, all of these game managers will be inheriting from the UI base class so that whenever we open their menus, we can pause the game and make sure there's only one menu open at a single time. Okay, now if I open up UI base class. So UI base class is going to inherit from mono behavior. We will need some static variables in order to keep track of which menu is open and whether a menu is open or not. So I'm going to add in all the variables. Of course, each UI menu will have their own menu that they will open and close. And now we need to add a bunch of functions that will be used by every single menu. So first of all, I'm going to make a function to open the menu and one to close the menu. So when we open the menu, we want to do a few different things. We want to freeze time, change the cursor lock state. We want to set the menu active. We want to set the current menu as menu, and we want to set menu open to be true. Next up is the close menu, where we basically do the same things except toggle them to the opposite. After this, I'm going to add another function called current menu is this. So this is just a function that will check if the current menu that is open is this menu. Now, if we think about it, different UI menus may need to do different things whenever we open the menu. So the open menu function needs to be a bit more variable. So these are the default things that we want to do for every single time we open a menu, regardless of which menu it is. However, some menus may have specific things they want to do whenever they open the menu and whenever they close the menu. So the way to get around this, instead of overriding the whole function and retyping all of this, what I did was add another function that is made to be overridden. So here I'm going to create a virtual method, and I'm just going to do return. So actually, when we do use this base, when other classes inherit from this base class, they can override this method and then add whatever functions they want to it. Then here, before we set the menu as active, we'll just call open menu functions. We also will do the same thing for the close menu function. After this, there's one more function to make. So I'm going to create the function toggle menu, which makes sure that we can only open the menu if no other menus are open, and also make sure to close the menu correctly based on which menu is currently open. The reason we made this here is so that we can handle all of the logistics for opening and closing menus without having to do it everywhere else. So we can do it all in one place, making sure that we only open menus based on certain criteria. With that, we finished the base UI class. So now the next thing to do is to update the player controller and the inventory system so that we can move over interacting with objects to the player controller. So I'm going to open up both of them. So first let's start with the player controller. I'm going to add a static player controller instance so that later on the other manager systems can refer to it. Of course, it's going to have a get and a private set so that nothing can change these instances willy-nilly. Afterwards, I'm going to be adding a new header and with the variables that we need to do player interaction. So if you do recall, the things we need to do player interaction is actually the camera position, the player reach float, which tells us how far the player can reach, as well as, and we're also going to be adding a interactable object variable so that we can keep track of what's the current object we're hovering over. Remember that the current hovered object is what we're also going to be using to make sure to tell our interactable object when to turn on and off the outline. So based on what the current hover object is. So in start, we need to set the instance to be this. And then we actually need to set the interactable object player controller here. Because there's so many instances of interactable object, it's better to set the static player controller in start of player controller instead of an interactable object so the code doesn't run over and over and over. Now if we go to fix update, instead of checking directly with the inventory system to see if the inventory is open, we can actually check with UI base class. So if we do not UI base class dot menu open. So here we're just using the UI base class static bool to check if the menu is open or not. And if it isn't, then we can swim or float. So this makes sure that swimming and floating is all disabled whenever any menu is open. After this, if I go down to update, because today in the player controller we won't need to be touching much of the movement functions, so I'm just going to minimize most of them. So here in update, here's what I'm going to be doing, interacting with objects. So for now, I'm just going to delete this, and I'm going to have the debug function as the first one. So because we only want the hover to work if none of the menus are open, I'm just going to do this. So if any menu is open, we'll just skip over all of the rest of the functions below. Now here I can put in look around, and now we can do interacting with objects. So I'm going to actually create a new region. So here I'm going to create a function hover object that does a raycast. It's actually the same code from the inventory system. So if I go to the inventory system and see here hover object function, I'm just going to copy and paste it. So you see we already added all of the bools we needed to do the function and all that. So here we have hover object, we moved it over from inventory system. So after look around, we can also do hover object. So we're going to set the current hover object by doing hover object, and then if it's not null, we can outline the object, after which we can check if the player has that clicks on the mouse button, and if they do and the item is interactable, we can use the inventory system to pick up the item. In future, I'm going to be adding functions to display the name of the item, but that will be in a future episode. So here we can put in the highlight function, which will enable the outline. Disabling the outline will be done later in the interactable object script itself. So here we check if the player left clicks on the item and also if the item is interactable. Then we can do the function. So later we're going to make sure the pickup item function is available in inventory system. So that's all the changes we need for player controller to move interacting with objects with player controller. Later on in this area here, we can add more functions to allow for interaction with different menu types. For example, interacting with the crafting table, which will give you which will actually open the menu instead of picking up the item, and interacting with a chest or storage unit, and that will open up the storage menu instead of picking up the item. So we'll add that later on. In Player Controller, don't forget to also change Start to Awake. Now if we go to Interactable Object, we need to delete Hover Object from here because we've moved it over to Player Controller. And we need to make Pickup Item public so that Player Controller can access it. So to start off, instead of inheriting from mono behavior, we need to change the inventory system to direct from UI base class. Now we can delete things like the inventory tab as well as the inventory open because these are values that are kept track of in the UI base class. We also don't need camera or player reach because those are for interaction, which we are already done in the player controller. So we can just delete this function here. We're also going to be editing the grid object later so that it's compatible with the storage system. So don't worry about the errors for now. So now, instead of having all of this fuss here, when we press tab, we can actually just do toggle menu. Now we can delete interactable object and this part here. And also don't forget, we changed our interactable object to interactable UI object. So we're just going to change this to interactable UI object. So if you recall here, this is the function that checks for what object you're hovering over when the menu is open. So it's outside the jurisdiction of player controller. Remember the extended external input module. So here we want to actually, instead of checking for interactable object, we want to check for interactable UI object because that's what is on the prefab now. And at the same time, I'm also going to streamline this a bit by changing this from 2 if statements to just a single one. So we check if we click the mouse button and the event system pointer is over the object. Now that we've done that, we can go back over to interactable object, and here in update, we just need to check if the player controller if this is the item the player controller is currently hovering, and if it isn't, we'll turn off the highlighting. So we check if the current hover object is this object, and if it isn't, or if the object isn't interactable at all, then we can turn off the highlight. Oh, I made a mistake here. This is supposed to be get mouse button down and not just button down. Oh, here, one last thing in the inventory system. Since we moved the interaction to player controller, we no longer have cam. So here what I'm going to do is player controller.instance.camera so that we have the position where we want to spawn in the item when we remove it from inventory. So now if we go back to Unity, we see now that all of the prefabs actually do have outlines now. However, we did miss something. In the play controller, we need to set the camera to the main camera, and we need to set the play reach to be 5. So for now, we do have the outline script for all of the items. However, we're running into problems with the inventory system because grid object has not been set up for the changes that we made, especially with the UI prefab. We will edit the grid object script later. So back to the Unity. Here I'm going to make sure that the outlines look nice. So I'm actually going to change the outline color to be yellow, as well as change the outline width to 4. So if we click play, we should be able to see what the outline looks like. So here on this bush, we have an outline of 4, and it looks pretty good. So as usual, I'm just going to disable it, and then I'm going to save it as a preset. So I go to presets. I'm just going to save it as outline preset. I'm going to apply this to the prefabs. So now I save it as a preset. I'm going to go to prefabs and I'm going to go to items. I'm just going to select all of them and set it as the preset and disable them all. I'm also going to do the same with the crafting table, because when we hover over it, we also want it to have an outline. If we go back to interactable object, there was actually a bug here. I did ol dot get component outline. It's actually supposed to be equal so that we can get set ol. So for now, let's move on to the second part of the video, which is setting up the storage manager. So to do that first, we're actually going to need to reconfigure the inventory, because we're going to create the storage manager by inheriting from the inventory system. And to do that, we need to make some changes to it first. So the first thing we need to look at is our grid object. Because in the storage manager, when we spawn in items into either a storage unit or in the inventory, we need to keep track of which one it is in, inventory or storage unit. So we're going to need to change the grid object so that they can take this in also. So here we don't need the inventory tab anymore because we have the UI base class menu. After this, if I go to the scene set item, so we want to add an inventory system. Because the storage manager is going to inherit from inventory system, we can put either of them here under inventory system. So this is going to be the storage manager or the inventory system. So most of this is the same, but here instead of inventory tab, we're going to do isystem.menu.transform. The storage system will have its own separate grid. So when we want to set a new item, we're going to need the specific grid of whichever system it is, the storage or inventory. Also, we're going to need to change interactable object to interactable UI object because the prefab uses UI object now. One last thing, we also need to set the storage box of the interactable UI object. Since iSystem is set here, we can just set it to the current iSystem. And here, when we do set temp is real, we also need to put in the inventory system. Now, to set up the inventory system so that we can we can use it as a base for the storage system. We're going to change the grid to be internal so that the storage system can have its own separate grid. We're also going to generalize the inventory list so that we can call it items list. So both places will have their own items list, one of them for the inventory, one of them for the current storage item, the current storage unit. We will also be changing update to be internal virtual so that it can be overridden by the storage update and changed. Now we will also be changing the interacting with items function so that they can be more versatile. So instead of just interacting with outside of the inventory, you can also interact with storage unit as well. So first of all, I'm going to change remove item. We're going to generalize remove item. So we're going to do item list.remove. And then instead of instantiating here, we would only instantiate when we're sure. So the remove item can be used when either moving an item from one storage area to a different one, or when we throw it out of the inventory. But only when we throw it out of the inventory, we want to instantiate the prefab. So we're going to be moving that piece of code somewhere else. Next up, we're going to create an alternate version of remove item, which allows us to remove multiple items at once. So this function will mainly be used by the crafting table, so that when you craft an object, you can remove all of the items from a given list from the inventory. After this, I'm going to create two new functions. One of them is called add item, so it's basically the opposite of remove item. So add item is the same as pickup item, except that pickup item is more specific to items being picked up from outside any inventory, whereas add item will be used for all functions whenever we pick up an item from outside the inventory or when we're moving it from one storage unit to another and things like that. So it's a more generalized code. So if we add an item and it manages to sort, we can return true, and but if it doesn't manage to sort, we can return false to stop the add item process. Now we can do the two other functions. So here we can delete all of these, and instead we'll do add item here. So if we can successfully add the item to the inventory, we can destroy it. Now we have one last function, which is move item. So in the case if you are in the inventory system and the item is in the inventory system, when you move an item, that means you want to move it from the inventory system to the currently open storage system. So that's what this function is for. It'll also be a virtual method so that it can be overridden, so that if you're in the storage manager and you try to move an item, it will move from the storage menu to the inventory menu. It'll make more sense later when I show you how it works. Just note that since this is the inventory system, it'll move from inventory system to storage system. And if it's in the storage system, it'll move from the storage system to the inventory system. So for the move item function, if we're in a storage menu, we want to move the item to the storage. However, if we are in the regular inventory system menu, that means we want to throw the item out of the storage and just throw it into the world. So yeah, we can use if current menu is this to check whether the inventory is open, and if it is, we'll just spawn it into the world. And if we're not, we'll do the function that spawns it in the storage manager system. Then if the current menu isn't this, that means the storage menu is open, so we will send it to the other side. For now, since we haven't created the storage menu, I'll just put a debug log over here. Now for the last few sets, we need to set some of these items to be virtual so they can be overridden in the storage menu so that they can be slightly different. So we need to change some of these functions to be internal so that we can access them when we're overriding some of the other functions in our storage system. So here I'm changing inventory list to items list also. And here for set temp is real, I have to set it to the instance. So if the current instance is inventory system, it will know that it's an inventory system. But if the command is from storage system, it will set the instance as the one from storage system. With that, our inventory system is all prepared to work with the storage system. Of course, we need to set a few things before we do that. So if we go to the game manager, the inventory system, we have to set the menu again. For now, I'm just going to put a few random items. So as you can see, we've opened the menu, our mouse is free, and we close the menu, our mouse isn't. And when we press tab, the toggle menu works properly. So we can't move, and we can't hover over items. Okay, before we finally move on to making the storage system, there's one more thing we need to do. We need to actually set up the script execution order. So if I go to Edit and I go to Project Settings, here we can see our script execution order. This is really useful if you want certain scripts to go before other scripts, or if you want to change the order of the scripts. This mainly works for update, awake. It doesn't actually work for start, so keep note of that. So here I'm just going to get the inventory system, and I'm going to put it before the default time so that it loads before all the default time scripts load. Here I'm also going to do player controller to be right after default time, and then right after player controller I'm going to do interactable object here to make sure that we can get the player controller instance on interactable object. So yeah, we'll be adjusting the script execution order as we go. Now we can finally get into storage. So to make the storage, I'm going to go into scripts and I'm going to create a new folder called storage. The first thing we need to do in storage is to create a new script called storage unit. Storage unit will inherit from interactable object, so it will highlight when hovered over, but it will also each instance of storage unit will have its own list of item scriptable objects so that it can keep track of which storage units contain what items. So I'm just going to create it real quickly. So here I'm just going to do a public list of item scriptable objects. And here I'm just going to change it to inherit from interactable object. Now I'm going to set up a chest so that we can put storage unit on it. I forgot to do this earlier when setting up all of the other items. I'm just going to take the chest that they have in the Fishes and Environment pack. I'm going to make it a bit bigger. So I'm just going to make it a normal prefab. But this time, instead of interactable object, we're going to use storage unit. So I'm just going to put in a couple of random items. So here I'm just going to make it a normal prefab. Then I'm going to create a scriptable object for it. Do know that this one also doesn't need a sprite because it's not something that can be picked up by the inventory. Now we can create the script to manage our storage. So if I go back to storage, I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to call it Storage Manager. Now we can open this up, and the first thing we're going to do is set this to inherit from inventory system. So how the storage system works is that when we open our inventory, it opens our inventory regularly, and then you can throw items out of the inventory. But then if we open a storage unit, for example, the chest that we just made, it's going to open a storage menu which will have its own separate grid, but it's also going to open the inventory menu. So we're going to be able to see both the inventory menu and the storage menu at the same time, just like in Subnautica. And then it will take note of which is the current storage unit, so which chest we are interacting with, and then it will be sure to display us the items in that chest. When we click on an item, it will tell us whether it is in the inventory or in the storage unit, and then we can do the appropriate functions to move them to the opposite side and resort both grids. So storage system is going to have its own separate grid from inventory system. So I'm going to add a few variables that we're going to need. First, we're going to replace the instance in inventory system with a new one of the storage manager. We're going to keep a reference to the current storage unit we have open, and we're going to keep a reference to the inventory menu so that we can open it when we open our storage menu. Here we'll need to set the instance as well as create a new grid because we're sort of overriding the awake in inventory system. Of course, we're going to be creating a grid with grid objects. Here we're going to be creating a new grid that will be under the storage menu instead of the inventory menu. Oh, one more thing I forgot to do in the inventory system. It was actually to change these to be internal so that we could access them from our storage manager. So here I'm just going to do grid width. I'm just going to finish the command. I'm also going to go to inventory system and actually copy the last part of this function. So it is the same function, we're just doing it a second time so we can spawn in a new one. Next we'll be working on the update, so we need to do an override of the update so that instead of doing the regular inventory system update, we have our own one. So unlike the inventory system, the menu here is open with interacting with the chest or storage unit and then closed by pressing tab. Because of this, we can't just toggle the menu with tab. So we are actually going to check if the menu is open and the current menu is this. Then we will close the menu by pressing tab. Of course, because Storage Manager inherits from inventory system, it also inherits from UI base class. So we can use all of the UI base class functions with no problem. So in this case, you're noticing that I'm using getKeyUp as compared to an inventory system where we use getKeyDown. This is because Storage Manager's code always plays before inventory system's code. So if the menu toggle for inventory system and storage system is in the same frame, storage system will always go first. This can lead to a situation where if you have the storage menu open and you press tab to close it, in the same frame that the menu is being closed, inventory system's tab can open up the inventory menu. That's why inventory manager's toggle menu has to go before storage manager's toggle menu. So that's why we use getKeyUp and getKeyDown. Anyways, here we can just use toggle menu again because it also has the functions to close the menu properly. So for the case of the storage unit, we're going to need to override the open menu functions because we also want to open the inventory menu game object whenever we open the storage unit without actually opening the inventory system menu. I'm also going to create a function that will set the storage. So whenever we call this function, it tells the storage manager which storage unit we're currently using. So this will mainly be called in the player controller whenever we interact with the storage manager. So it will tell us which is the current hovered object, and then we can get the storage units script from there. Whenever we set the storage, we also need to change the reference of the items list so that it refers to the current storage unit's item list. Oh, there was something I forgot when reconfiguring the inventory system. Here actually in sort items, we actually do need to make it internal also so that we can override it. We have to make it a virtual function, right? So here it's a virtual function so that if we go back to storage manager, we can override it. We're just going to override sort item so as to make sure that it sorts from the storage manager instead of the inventory system. But before that, I'm going to override move item. This is because in move item in inventory system, it specifically removes the item from inventory system and then moves it over to storage manager. However, in storage manager, we want to remove the item from storage manager and then move it over to inventory system. So it's almost exactly the same code. Okay, so in the move item function, earlier I forgot to add public to remove item in inventory system, but we actually need it here. So in the move item function, what we need to do is to add the item to inventory system. So I'm going to do this. So first of all, we need to add the item to the inventory system. However, we need to check if it does actually fit in the inventory system. So if it doesn't fit, then we actually mark it as failed. We mark it as failed and we return. However, if it does fit the move item, we can actually we can actually remove the item from the storage manager. So now we can go back to the Unity, and if we go to game manager, we can add the storage manager here. So we're going to need a storage manager window. So I'm just going to duplicate the inventory, and I'm going to call it storage. And then when we set it active, I'm actually going to set it to be on the left side of the page instead of the right. Yeah, so I'm going to set this as not active. This one I'm also going to make it, I also need to make the height such that it stretches with the height of the game. So I'm just going to do that also. So back to game manager, we can set the storage menu as the storage manager's menu. For items list, we leave it blank because it'll automatically be set by the storage unit. For our UI prefab, it's going to be the same as inventory, and so is our filler object. For current storage unit, we leave this blank because it's going to be automatically filled as well. And then for the inventory menu, we just need to drag in the inventory. Actually, in our code over here, earlier I made a small mistake. I accidentally forgot the semicolon and added an extra bracket. So I'm just going to make sure this line of code is correct. Now in our inventory system, so here we're back in move item. So here we would remove the item and then we would check the current menu. If the current menu is the inventory, then we would spawn it into the world and then return for the function. But here we will need to check if the item can be moved over to the storage manager's current open storage unit. So here, if we can't add the item, we would need a debug log. In this case, we're trying to move from the inventory to the storage, so I'm going to write cannot fit in storage. And since it can't fit, we would have to add the item back to inventory. So in the storage manager, we remove the item after we successfully added it to the inventory. But in this case, we will need to check if the current menu is this one. So we remove the item first and then instantiate to prevent any accidental cases where the item can be duplicated. So here now we have the two different move item functions, one for inventory system and one for storage manager. Now if we go over to player controller, the only interaction with objects that we have added is the one to pick up items with the inventory system. However, we're going to use tags to differentiate between specific items such as the crafting tables or storage units so that we can open up those menus instead of picking up the item. So first of all, I'm going to use tags to differentiate these items. So if I go to the chest, I can tag it and I can create a new tag and I'm going to call it storage. And then I can do the same for the crafting table. So I set this to storage. Then on the crafting table, I'll set the new tag as crafting. So with these tags set, I can now create a reference to the storage manager in player controller and then set it in awake. Now if I go back down to update and we go over here, I'm going to add another if statement. So here we're just going to check if the tag is storage. So if the tag is storage, that means we want to, instead of picking up the item, we want to open the menu. So I'll set the storage to be the current hover object, and then I'll toggle the storage manager's menu. So this will set the correct storage and then also toggle the menu. And then we return so that we don't pick up the chest. Later on, we'll be doing the exact same thing, but for crafting as well. If we look at UI base class, there was also another bug here. After opening the menu, it's supposed to return. We also need to remove the if from current menu as this. Here in the inventory system, we also need to change this code here to instead use the move item code. So here we'll take the item, the storage box of the item, which means the corresponding whether it's in the inventory or in the storage, and then we will move the item. So if it's in the inventory, it will move to the storage, or if it's in the storage, it will move to the inventory. Now, before we test the game, we need to head back to the project settings, and now we need to set the storage manager to also go before the inventory system. So now if we click play, if we look here, we can actually interact with the chest to store and take out items. So that's all for the storage system. Hope you enjoyed the video. Want to support what we do? You can help us by becoming a patron. This will give us access to all of the Patreon posts. You can access the project files, and you can see some Patreon exclusive content on the blog too. Link in the description. Yeah, so any support you give us will go a long way. We're only making about 20 cents for every dollar we put into our content creation. So your help in becoming a patron will go a long way for helping us make this a sustainable endeavor. See you in the next video.